Praise of the Caesar Julian, AD 356. While fate was weaving this intricate web of events in the Roman world, the Caesar at Vienna, whom the Augustus had taken as his colleague in his own 8th consulship, was dreaming, such was his native energy, of the din of battle, and the slaughter of the barbarians, and getting ready to restore the shattered fragments of the province, if fortune would only grant him a favourable wind. The great improvements which his valour and good luck enabled him to bring about in Gaul surpass many of the heroic actions of former times, and I shall therefore describe them one by one in due order. I intend to employ all the resources of my modest talent in the hope that they will prove adequate for the purpose. My narrative, which is not a tissue of clever falsehoods, but an absolutely truthful account based on clear evidence, will not fall far short of a panegyric, because it seems that the life of this young man was guided by some principle which raised him above the ordinary, and accompanied him from his illustrious cradle to his last breath. By a series of rapid steps he attained such distinction both at home and abroad, that in sagacity he was renowned the reincarnation of Titus the son of Vespasian, in the glorious outcome of his campaigns very like Trajan, as merciful as Antoninus, and in his striving after truth and perfection the equal of Marcus Aurelius, on whom he endeavoured to model his actions and character. We are told by Cicero that great achievements are like trees, in the height of which we take more pleasure than in their roots and trunks. Similarly, the origins of this gifted nature were obscured by a number of overclouding circumstances, but ought in fact to be more regarded than his later wonderful exploits, seeing that he was brought up in seclusion, like Erechtheus by Minerva, and that it was not from a soldier's tent, but from the quiet shades of the academy that he was drawn into the dust of battle, overthrew the Germans, and, by spilling the blood of their ferocious kings, or making them prisoners, brought peace to the valleys of the freezing Rhine. Julian attacks and defeats the Alemanni. While he was passing a busy winter at Vienna, he heard through one of the rumours which flew ceaselessly about that the barbarians had made a surprise attack upon the ancient city of Autun, whose walls were of great extent but crumbling with age, and that while the troops stationed there remained inactive, a body of veterans who were on the alert had rushed to its defence. It so often happens that sudden perils are averted by the courage of despair, so without any relief from his anxieties and ignoring the servile flattery of his suite, who tried to turn his mind towards pleasures and luxuries, he made all necessary preparations, and on the 24th of June arrived at Autun, intending, like a seasoned commander of proved strength and sagacity, to attack the barbarians, who were scattered over the country, as soon as an opportunity offered. At a council of war to consider the safest route, held with the assistance of men who knew the terrain, diverse opinions were expressed, some asserting that he should go by Sedulaucum and Cora, and others recommending a different route. When, however, some added that Silvanus, recently master of infantry, had with considerable difficulty taken 8,000 auxiliary troops by a way which provided a short-cut but was dangerous because it lay through dark woods, the Caesar was on fire to imitate the example of this bold general. To avoid delay he took with him only the cuirassiers and artillerymen, an inadequate escort for a commander, and reached Auxerre by Sylvanus' route. After a short halt to refresh himself and his men, it was never his habit to pause for long, Julian made his way towards Troyes. The barbarians hurled themselves upon him in successive bands. In some cases, when their superior numbers alarmed him, he did no more than close his ranks and keep an eye on the enemy. At other times he won an easy victory by descending on them from a point of vantage. Some gave themselves up in panic. The rest took to flight as best they could, and were allowed to get away unharmed, because he was hindered from pursuing by the weight of his equipment. At last, as his confidence grew in resisting their attacks, he accomplished his hazardous march to Troyes, where his arrival was so unexpected that when he was practically knocking at the gates, the inhabitants, who lived in dread of the host of the barbarians spread about the country, opened them only after serious hesitation. After a brief halt to rest his tired troops, believing that speed was essential, he set off for Rheims, where he had ordered his forces to concentrate and wait for him. Rheims was under the command of Marcellus, Ursicinus' successor, and Ursicinus himself had received orders to remain in the same area until the end of the campaign. After canvassing a number of possibilities, Julian decided to attack the Alemanni by way of Decem-Pagi, and the troops marched in that direction in close order with unusual spirit. The day was damp and grey, so that it was difficult to see even at close range. The enemy had the advantage of local knowledge, and taking a cross route attacked 2 legions which formed the rearguard of the Caesar's army. They would almost have annihilated them if a sudden shout had not brought the allied troops to the rescue. From that time, Julian, thinking that he could not cross roads or rivers without risk of an ambush, became cautious and deliberate, qualities which are of particular advantage in great generals, and often enable them to relieve and preserve their armies. So, hearing that the barbarians had occupied and were living on the territories of Strasbourg, Braumath, Reisenborn, Seltz, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, they avoided the actual towns as if they were tombs surrounded by nets. He first of all seized Braunth. When he was approaching it, he was met with a body of Germans who offered battle. Julian drew up his forces in a crescent formation, so that, when battle was joined, the enemy found themselves threatened on both sides. Some were taken prisoner, others were cut to pieces in the very heat of the action, and the remainder scattered and took refuge in flight. Julian recovers Cologne. After this, there was no resistance, and Julian decided to recover Cologne, which had been destroyed before his arrival in Gaul. In all that region there is no city or fort to be seen, except that near Colbens, which is called after the confluence of the Moselle and the Rhine. There is a town called Remagen, and near Cologne itself a single fort. So once he had entered Cologne, he did not stir out until the kings of the Franks were cowed into submission, and he could conclude a peace which would bring advantage to the state for a time, until he could get the city strongly fortified. Then, encouraged by these first fruits of victory, he departed by way of Trier, to spend the winter at the convenient town of Sens. He had to carry on his shoulder, as they say, the burden of a spate of wars, and to divide his attention between a number of problems. how to get the troops who had abandoned their usual posts back to the places which were threatened, how to scatter the tribes which had conspired to injure the name of Rome, and how to ensure that the army which was to be dispersed in different directions should not lack provisions. Julian is besieged by the Alemanni in Sens. While he was anxiously weighing these matters, he was attacked by a horde of the enemy hoping to capture the town, and the more confident of doing so because deserters had betrayed the fact that he had with him neither the Scutari nor the Gentiles. These had been dispersed in various towns for the convenience of providing food or other stores, so he shut the gates and strengthened the walls where they were weak. Night and day he was to be seen in person with his men on the ramparts and battlements, grinding his teeth with rage because the small numbers of the troops with him frustrated all his efforts to break out. After a month, the barbarians withdrew dispirited, complaining that it had been futile and foolish to think of besieging a town. But a disgraceful feature of this affair was that Marcellus, the master of cavalry, who was stationed nearby, neglected to come to the help of the Caesar in peril. Quite apart from the presence of the prince, he should have intervened with his forces to deliver the city from the hardships of a siege. Once this anxiety was relieved, the Caesar devoted all his efforts to ensuring that, after such protracted toil, his men should enjoy a period of rest. It could be only short, but it would be enough to recruit their strength. The region was in so destitute a state after frequent devastation that it could supply little in the way of food, but even this difficulty was overcome by his unfailing energy. He succeeded in inspiring his men with higher hopes of success, and embarked with confidence on the execution of his numerous plans. The merits of Julian. In the first place, he imposed upon himself and practised strict self-discipline, no mean achievement. He behaved as if he were bound by the sumptuary laws which the Romans copied from the Rhetari, or law code of Lycurgus. These were long observed at Rome, and when they were falling into disuse, were gradually revived by the dictator Sulla, who agreed with Democritus in thinking that fortune provides a man's table with luxuries, virtue with only a frugal meal. This point was also stressed by Cato of Tusculum, whose frugal way of life earned him the name Censorius. Great worry about food, he said, implies great indifference to virtue. Finally, though he constantly read the instructions which Constantius had written out for him with his own hand, as if he were sending a younger relative to the university, and in which he made very liberal provisions for the expense of the Caesar's table, Julian forbade such delicacies as pheasant and sow's womb and udders to be ordered and served for him, and contented himself with the cheap food of the common soldiers, whatever it might be. Another feature of his routine was that he divided the nights into 3 periods and gave one to sleep, one to business, and one to study. This is said to have been the practice of Alexander the Great, but Julian showed much greater resolution. Alexander used to keep his arm outside his bed over a bronze basin and hold a silver ball in his hand, so that when sleep came upon him and relaxed his muscles, he might be awakened by the sound of its fall. Julian, however, needed no artificial aid to wake him whenever he willed. He always rose halfway through the night, not from a bed of down with a coverlet of short silk, but from a rug and coarse blanket, which the common people call cisurna. Then he prayed in private to Mercury, who according to the theologians is the intelligence of the universe and the cause of activity in slower minds. In these austere conditions he dealt in detail with public business, and when he had finished this hard and important task, turned to the improvement of his mind. The eagerness with which he pursued the sublime knowledge of first principles and sought nourishment for his soul in its ascent to ever loftier regions defies exaggeration, but his learned studies took him through all the departments of philosophy. But the full and perfect knowledge which he acquired in these matters did not cause him to neglect more mundane subjects. He gave a reasonable degree of attention to poetry and rhetoric, as is shown by the pure and dignified style of his speeches and letters, and also to the complexities of domestic and foreign history. Furthermore, he knew Latin well enough to be able to discourse in it. If it is true, as various writers report, that King Cyrus and Simonides the lyrical poet, and Hippias of Elis, the most acute of the sophists, owe their retentive memory to drinking certain medicines, we must believe that Julian in his early manhood emptied a whole cask of the mnemonic potion, if such a thing were found. This, then, is the evidence of purity and virtue which his knights provided. But what filled his days? His brilliant and witty talk, his exertions in preparing for battle or on the actual field, his large-minded and liberal reforms in civil administration, shall be related in detail as occasion rises. Being a prince as well as a philosopher, he had to practice the rudiments of military training, and when he found himself learning the Pyrrhic march step to the sound of the fife, he would often call out the name of Plato and repeat the old proverb, "Pack saddles are put on the ox, they are no fit burden for me." Once, on an official occasion, some members of the Secret Service were brought with others into the presence of Julian to receive a gift of money, and one of them took it in his two cupped hands, not as etiquette requires, in a fold of his tunic. "Secret Service men," said the Emperor, "are better at seizing than receiving." The parents of a girl who had been raped appealed to him, and when he sentenced the perpetrator of the offence to banishment, complained that he was treating them unfairly in not punishing him with death. "The law," he said, "may blame my clemency, but an emperor of merciful disposition should be above the law." When he was setting out on a campaign, and many appealed to him to redress their wrongs, he would send them to the provincial governors for a hearing. When he returned, he would ask what had happened in each case, and be led by his native mildness to modify the punishments inflicted. Finally, to say nothing of the victorious battles in which he routed the barbarians, who often fell fighting to the last, the benefits which he conferred on impoverished Gaul when it was at the last grasp are most clearly illustrated by this fact. When he first arrived, he found that 25 gold pieces per head were extracted by way of tribute. When he left, 7 sufficed to satisfy all demands. This was like bright sunshine breaking through dark cloud, and was greeted everywhere with dances of joy. Lastly, we know that up to the end of his reign and of his life, he observed the useful principle of not remitting arrears of tribute by what are called indulgences. He knew that by doing so he would benefit only the rich, since everyone is aware that the poor are compelled to pay the whole sum due at the very beginning of a tax period, with no possibility of relief. But while he was putting into effect these methods of government, which should serve as a model to all good rulers, the fury of the barbarians burst out more violently than ever. They were like wild beasts, which have acquired the habit of stealing their prey through the neglect of the shepherds. Even when a stronger guard is substituted, they do not desist, but continue their attacks upon flocks and herds, maddened by hunger and regardless of their own safety, just as the barbarians, having consumed what they had plundered, were driven by famine to renew their raids. Sometimes they carried off a prize, at other times they perished before they could make a capture. The consular arbitio is accused and acquitted. These were the events of that year in Gaul, where a doubtful prospect ended in a favourable issue, but at the court of the Augustus, Arbitio was the object of howls of envy. It was asserted that in the expectation of reaching the summit of power, he had already equipped himself with the insignia of empire, and a count called Verissimus raised a hideous clamour against him, declaring publicly that he was not content with having risen from the ranks to high military command, but this to him seemed a mere trifle, and that he was aiming at the imperial throne. Arbitio was particularly hounded by one Dorus, a former military surgeon. I have already related how, on being promoted under Magnentius to the charge of protecting the treasures of Rome, Dorus accused Adelphius, the urban prefect, of nursing improper ambitions. The affair of Arbitio came to court, and when all the formalities were in train and people were waiting to hear the charge proved, the chamberlains, as persistent rumour had it, suddenly intervened. Without discussion, those who had been arrested as accomplices were released, Dorus vanished, and Verissimus fell silent, as suddenly as an actor when the curtain has come down. The Grand Chamberlain Eutherius defends Julian. At the same period, Constantius, learning by hearsay that Marcellus had failed to succour the Caesar when he was besieged at Sens, dismissed him from the service and ordered him home. Marcellus, labouring under a sense of great grievance, set on foot an intrigue against Julian, in the confident hope of gaining the ear of the Augustus, who was always ready to entertain an accusation. So when Marcellus left the army, Eutherius, the Grand Chamberlain, was sent straight after him to expose any fiction that he might concoct. Marcellus did not know this, and shortly afterwards arrived in Milan, where he stormed and raged before the council like the liar and all but maniac that he was. Emphasizing his words with violent gestures, he accused Julian of arrogance, and alleged that he was already presenting his wings for a higher flight. When he was giving free rein to these inventions, Eutherius asked and was granted admission. He was told to speak his mind, and showed in moderate and respectful terms that the truth had been overlaid with lies. The fact was that while Marcellus was procrastinating, it was thought deliberately the Caesar, by his energy and alertness, had repelled the barbarians who were besieging him at Sens, and Eutherius was ready to stake his own life that, as long as he lived, Julian would be a faithful servant to the man to whom he owed his promotion. In this context, I feel impelled to add a brief account of this same Eutherius. It may perhaps sound incredible, because if even Numa, Pompilius, or Socrates were to speak well of a eunuch and back their statements with an oath, they would be accepted of departing from the truth. But roses grow in the midst of thorns, and among wild beasts there are some that grow tame, so I will run over briefly the principal facts that are established about him. He was born in Armenia. His parents were free, but at an early age he was captured by members of a neighbouring hostile tribe, who castrated him and sold him to some Roman merchants, by whom he was brought to Constantine's palace. There, as he grew up, he displayed rectitude and intelligence. He received an education suitable to his condition, and showed outstanding acuteness in the study and solution of abstruse and thorny problems. He had a prodigious memory, and was so eager to be of service and so full of sound judgment that if the Emperor Constans had followed the honourable and upright course which Eutharius, who was then of mature age, urged upon him, he would have committed no faults, or at the worst only such as were venial. In his position as chamberlain he sometimes rebuked even Julian for being wedded to Asiatic manners, and in consequence frivolities. Soon after withdrawing into retirement, he was again summoned to the palace. He was calm and unusually consistent, and he cultivated the virtues of loyalty and moderation to such a degree that he was never charged with the betrayal of a confidence, unless it was to save another's life, or with the passion for gain which the rest of the courtiers exhibited. Hence it came about that when he afterwards retired to Rome, where he fixed his residence in old age, he carried a clear conscience about with him, and was cherished and loved by people of all classes, whereas in general men of his kind look out for a secret retreat in which to enjoy their ill-gotten wealth, and hide like creatures who hate the light from the eyes of the multitude of those whom they have wronged. Turning over the copious records of the past, I have not found any eunuch with whom I would compare him. There were some in old times who were loyal and honest, though very few, but their characters were spotted in other ways, mixed with the acquired or natural good qualities which any of them possessed was rapacity, or contemptibly brutal manners, or a propensity to inflict harm, or excessive obsequiousness to the great, or the haughtiness which arises from the possession of power. But a man so armed at all points as Eutharius, I confess, that I have never read or heard of, and in saying this I rely on the ample evidence available in our time. If some minute antiquarian should cite against me the example of Menophilus, the eunuch of Mithridates, king of Pontus, let me remind him that nothing is known about Menophilus except his heroic behaviour in a desperate crisis, the king in question having lost a great battle against the Romans under Pompey, fled to the kingdom of Colchis, and left his grown daughter Dryptina, who was gravely ill, in the care of Menophilus at the castle of Cynora. This girl completely recovered under his medical treatment, and Menophilus was doing his utmost to protect her for her father, when Malleus Priscus, one of Pompey's lieutenants, laid siege to the fortress in which she was kept. Menophilus, realizing that the garrison was contemplating surrender, and fearing that it would bring shame on her father if the girl survived to be captured and raped, killed her and then plunged his sword into his own vitals. Now let me return to the point from which I digressed. Denunciations and slanders at Constantius' court. After Marcellus had been foiled, as I have told, and had returned to Sophia, his place of origin, many shocking crimes were committed at the Augustus's court on the pretext of protecting his imperial majesty. If anyone consulted a soothsayer because he had heard a shrew mouse squeak, or met a weasel, or encountered any similar omen, or if he used an old wives' charm to relieve pain, a practice which even medical authority allows, he was denounced through some agency which he could not guess, brought to trial, and punished with death. About this time a native of Salona called Danus was accused by his wife, who wished merely to frighten him, of some trivial offence. Somehow or other Rufinus, who had kept his position as head of the Praetorian Prefect's staff by his servility, got to know her. Rufinus, as I have said, was a man who transmitted information from the agent Gaudentius which led to the death of Africanus, governor of Pannonia, and his guests. With his usual boastful talk, he shamefully seduced this light woman and then cajoled her into a dangerous plot. He persuaded her to accuse her innocent husband of treason by weaving a tissue of lies, and to allege that he and some accomplices had stolen and were concealing a purple pall from the tomb of Diocletian. Having set on foot this plan to involve many people in ruin, Rufinus, in the expectation of bettering himself, flew to the emperor's court to open his usual campaign of slander. When the affair was known, Mavortius, a man of high integrity, who was then Praetorian Prefect, received orders to conduct a strict inquiry in conjunction with Ursulus, Count of the Largesse, who was also a person of commendable severity. The matter was magnified after the fashion of the age, but though several people were put to torture, nothing was discovered, and the judges were unwavering, unsure between two minds, when at last stifled truth regained her breath. Under the pressure of necessity, the woman confessed that Rufinus was the author of the whole intrigue, and did not even suppress the fact of her foul adultery, whereupon the judges consulted the statutes, and came with one mind to the decision that both criminals should be condemned to death. At this news Constantius flew into a passion of grief, as if he had lost the one man on whom his own safety depended. He dispatched a body of expert riders to command Ursulus in threatening terms to return to court. When he arrived, an attempt was made to prevent him from vindicating the truth, but Ursulus paid no attention to those who stood in his way, and burst boldly into the emperor's cabinet, where he set out the facts in plain words which came from his heart. This confident behaviour stopped the mouths of flatterers and saved the prefect and himself from serious danger. An incident then occurred in Aquitaine, which attracted attention outside the province. An old rascal was invited to a sumptuous and elegant banquet of the kind that often takes place in those parts. He noticed that the servants had arranged the covers of the couches in such a way that their broad borders presented an unbroken surface of purple, and that the same was true of the tablecloth. So he grasped the front part of his own cloak in each hand and folded it inwards so as to give his whole get-up the appearance of an imperial robe. This act ruined a rich estate. By a similar exercise of malice, a secret agent in Spain, who was likewise invited to a dinner, on hearing the slaves who were bringing in the lights at evening utter the customary formula, "May we prevail," gave a sinister interpretation to this traditional phrase, and thereby destroyed a noble house. Incidents of this kind became more and more frequent because Constantius was very nervous and always expecting to be attacked. In this he resembled Dionysus, the famous Sicilian tyrant, who was led by this same failing to have his daughters taught the barber's trade because he would not trust anyone else to shave them. The same Dionysus also enclosed the little building in which he used to sleep with a deep ditch crossed by a collapsible bridge. When he went to bed he dismantled the planks and pins and took them with him to be reassembled when he was going out at daybreak. Those who had influence at court surrounded those warnings of unrest like so many trumpets, in the hope of incorporating the property of the condemned with their own and finding opportunities for large depredations on the estates of their neighbours. There is clear documentary evidence that Constantine was the first to whet the appetite of his staff, but it was Constantius who crammed them with the marrow of the provinces. Under him the leading men of all classes were consumed by a passion for riches which knew no bounds and recognised no legal or moral restraint. Among the civilian officials, Rufinus, the Praetorian Prefect, took first place. Among the military, Arbitio, the master of cavalry. there were also the Grand Chamberlain Eusebius and the Questor, and in Rome itself the family of the Anisi, whose younger members, in an attempt to rival their ancestors, refused to be content with much greater possessions than their forebears. Negotiations for peace with the Persians. In the east, the Persians, abandoning their previous policy of hand-to-hand fighting for one of theft and robbery, kept driving off prizes of men and cattle. Sometimes they got away with the loot by a surprise attack, sometimes they lost it through their inferior numbers. Occasionally, they were prevented from even catching sight of a possible haul. Musonian, however, the Praetorian prefect, a man, as I have already said, with many good qualities, but venal and easily turned from the path of truth by a bribe, tried to get wind of the Persians' plan through agents expert in deception and subterfuge. His confidant in such matters was Cassian, Duke of Mesopotamia, a hardened veteran of many dangerous campaigns. The two of them, once they were assured by the unanimous reports of their spies that Sapor was at the furthest limit of his realm, where it was costing him much bloodshed to keep certain hostile tribes at bay, used some unknown soldiers to make a secret approach to Tamaspor, who commanded the Persians on our frontier. They suggested that if he had an opportunity he should urge the king by letter to make peace at last with the Roman Emperor. Once this was done, he would be secure on one front and free to deal with his permanent enemies. Tamaspor acquiesced, and in reliance on their good faith, reported to his king that Constantius was engaged in a very formidable war and begged for peace. A long time elapsed before this message reached the territory of Chionite and Euceni, where Sapor was spending the winter. Constantius makes a state visit to Rome, AD 357. While these arrangements were being made in the east and in Gaul to meet the needs of the time, Constantius, behaving as if the temple of Janus were shut and all his enemies overthrown, conceived a strong desire to visit Rome and celebrate the fall of Magnentius by a triumph to which he had no title, since it had been won by the spilling of Roman blood. He had not overcome in person any race that made war on him. No news had arrived that any had been defeated by the valour of his generals. He had added nothing to the empire. He had neither been seen fighting at the head of his men, or even in the front rank in moments of crisis. His object was simply to display his gold-inlaid standards and his brilliant retinue in a procession of inordinate length before the eyes of a populace that was living in peace and neither expected nor wished to see such a show. Perhaps he was unaware that the attendance of lictors had been enough for some of the earlier emperors in times of peace, and that in the heat of war, which forbids inaction, one of them had entrusted himself to a small fishing boat at the height of a raging storm. Another had followed the example of the Deci and vowed to sacrifice his life for the state. A third had personally made his way into the enemy's camp with some common soldiers, and several, in a word, had distinguished themselves by heroic deeds and left a glorious memory to be cherished by their descendants. So, in the second prefecture of Afritius, when large funds had been laid out on the trappings of the show, Constantius passed through Ocriculum in tremendous state, escorted by a formidable body of troops. It was almost as if a campaign were in prospect, and the sight attracted the unwavering gaze of all beholders. As he approached the city, he let his eyes dwell without expression on the senators paying their humble duty, and the venerable images of the patrician families. It did not occur to him, as it had to Cineas, the celebrated envoy of Pyrrhus, that he was beholding an assembly of kings. His thought was rather that here was a place of sanctuary for the whole world, and when he turned towards the populace he was amazed to see what numbers of people of every race had flocked to Rome. His own appearance might have been designed as a show of strength to overawe the Euphrates or the Rhine. A double line of standards went before him, and he himself was seated on a golden car gleaming with various precious stones, whose mingled radiance seemed to throw a sort of shimmering light. Behind the motley cavalcade that preceded him, the emperor's person was surrounded by purple banners woven in the form of dragons, and attached to the tops of gilded and jewelled spears. The breeze blew through their gaping jaws, so that they seemed to be hissing with rage, and their voluminous tails streamed behind them on the wind. On each side marched a file of men-at-arms, with shields and plumed helmets, whose shining breastplates cast a dazzling light. At intervals were mailed cavalrymen, the so-called ironclads, wearing masks and equipped with cuirasses and belts of steel. They seemed more like statues polished by the hands of Praxiteles than living men. Their limbs were entirely covered by a garment of thin circular plates fitted to the curves of the body, and so cunningly articulated that it adapted itself to any movement the wearer needed to make. The emperor was greeted with welcoming cheers, which were echoed from the hills and riverbanks, but in spite of the din, he exhibited no emotion, but kept the same impassive air as he commonly wore before his subjects in the provinces. Though he was very short, he stooped when he passed under a high gate. Otherwise, he was like a dummy, gazing straight before him, as if his head were in a vice and turning neither to the right nor to the left. When a wheel jolted, he did not nod, and at no point was he seen to spit or to wipe or rub his face or nose, or to move his hand. All this was no doubt affectation, but he gave other evidence too, in his personal life, of an unusual degree of self-control, which one was given to believe belonged to him alone. As for his habit, throughout his reign, of never allowing any private person to share his carriage or be his colleague in the consulship, as many deified emperors have, and many other similar customs which his towering pride led him to observe, as if they had all the sanctity of law, I will pass them by because I am conscious that I have reported them as they occurred. As soon as he entered Rome, the home of empire and of all perfection, he went to the rostra and looked with amazement at the forum, that sublime monument of pristine power. Wherever he turned, he was dazzled by the concentration of wonderful sights. After addressing the nobility in the Senate House and the people from the tribune, he entered the place amid many demonstrations of goodwill and tasted the happiness which he had promised himself. On several occasions when he held races in the circus, he was amused by the witty sallies of the people, who kept their traditional freedom of speech without any loss of respect, and he himself took care to observe the proper forms. He did not, for example, as he did in other cities, allow the length of the combats to depend on his own will, but followed the local custom, and let them finish in their various ways as events dictated. When he surveyed the different regions of the city and its environs, lying along the slopes and on level ground within the circle of the 7 hills, it seemed to him that whatever his eye first lit upon took the palm. It might be the shrine of Tarpeian Jupiter, beside which all else is like earth compared to heaven, or the buildings of the baths as big as provinces, or the solid mass of stone from Tiber that forms the amphitheatre, with its top almost beyond the reach of human sight, or the Pantheon, spread like a self-contained district under its high and lovely dome, or the lofty columns which spiral stairs to platforms which support the statues of former emperors, or the Temple of Rome, or the Forum of Peace, or the Theatre of Pompey, or the Odeon, or the Stadium, or any of the other sites of the Eternal City. But when he came to the Forum of Trajan, a creation which in my view has no like under the cope of heaven, and which even the gods themselves must agree to admire, he stood transfixed with astonishment, surveying the gigantic fabric around him. Its grandeur defies description, and can never again be approached by mortal men. So he abandoned all hope of attempting anything like it, and declared that he would and could imitate simply Trajan's horse, which stands in the middle of the court, with the emperor on its back. Prince Hormisdas, the Persian defector I have previously mentioned, who was near Constantius, remarked with oriental subtlety, "First, your majesty, you must have a similar stable built, if you can. The horse you propose to fashion should have as much space to range in as this which we see." The same Hormisdas, being asked what he thought of Rome, replied that only one thing about it gave him pleasure, the discovery that there too men were mortal. The emperor then, after viewing many sights with awe and amazement, complained of the weakness or malice of common report, which tends to exaggerate everything, but is feeble in its description of the wonders of Rome. So after much deliberation he determined to add to the beauties of the city by setting up an obelisk in the Circus Maximus. I will describe its provenance and appearance in the proper place. Meanwhile, Constantius' sister Helena, the Caesar Julian's wife, who had been summoned to Rome with a show of affection, fell victim to the arts of the Empress Eusebia. Eusebia had been childless all her life, and she treacherously prevailed on Helena to take an unusual drug, which would have the effect of causing a miscarriage whenever she conceived. She had already made her lose a male child in Gaul. The device she then employed was to bribe the midwife to kill the baby as soon as it was born by cutting the umbilical cord too short. So carefully was it contrived that the bravest of men should be childless. The emperor would have liked to stay longer in the grandest of all cities to enjoy unalloyed ease and pleasure, but he was alarmed by frequent, reliable reports that the Suebi were attacking the two provinces of Raetia and the Quadi Valeria, and that the Sarmatians, who are particularly expert marauders, were devastating Upper Moesia and Lower Pannonia. This news caused him to leave Rome on the 29th of May, a month after his arrival, and to hurry into Illyricum by way of Trent. From Trent he sent Severus, a veteran of ripe experience in war, to succeed Marcellus, and ordered Ursicinus to rejoin him. Ursicinus was pleased to receive this order and came to Sirmium with his staff. After much debate about the possibility reported by Musonian of making peace with the Persians, Ursicinus was sent back to the east as commander-in-chief. The older members of our company were promoted to commanders. The younger, of whom I was one, were told to attend on Ursicinus and be ready to perform any task that he imposed on us in the service of the state. Campaign of Julian against the Alemanni. The Caesar Julian passed a troubled winter at Sens. Then in his own second and the Augustus' 9th consulship, at a time when he was exposed on all sides to noisy threats from the Germans, he marched briskly towards Remis. The omens were favourable, and what particularly encouraged him was that the command had now passed to Servius, who was neither factious nor arrogant, and who had demonstrated his worth over a long period of service. He followed Julian, who was marching straight ahead, like an obedient soldier. From another direction, Barbato, who had been promoted Master of Infantry after the death of Silvanus, brought 25,000 men from Italy to August, at the Emperor's orders. Preparations had been made in pursuit of a deliberate plan to ensure that the Alemanni, who were being exceptionally aggressive and pushing their raids further than usual, should be squeezed into a narrow space by a pincer movement of our two armies and cut into pieces. While this plan was being translated into rapid action, the Latia, tribe quick to seize any opportunity of plunder, slipped unseen between our two armies and made a surprise attack on Lyon. They would have sacked it and burned it to the ground if they had not been checked by finding the gates closed, whereupon they laid waste whatever they could find outside the town. At the news of this catastrophe, the Caesar came to a quick decision to send 3 crack squadrons of light cavalry to watch the free routes by which he knew that the marauders must certainly make their escape. This move was successful. All who took these tracks were slaughtered, and all their loot was recovered intact. Only those got away unharmed who made their way undisturbed past the rampart of Barbito's camp. They were enabled to slip by because the tribune Binobaldes and Valentinian, the future emperor, who had been allocated this task with the squadrons under their command, were forbidden by Sella, the tribune of the Scutari, who had joined the campaign as Barbito's colleague, to guard the road by which they learnt that the Germans would withdraw. Not content with this, the Master of Infantry, who was a coward and indefatigable in disparaging Julian's exploits, knowing that the orders which he had given were injurious to the Roman cause, Sulla confessed as much when he was charged with it, sent a false report to Constantius that these same 2 tribunes had been sent on the pretext of duty to tamper with the troops under their command. For this they were cashiered and returned home as civilians. At the same period, the barbarians, who had settled on our side of the Rhine, were alarmed by the approach of our forces. Some of them cut down enormous trees and cleverly blocked the roads, which were difficult in any case and naturally steep. Others occupied the islands, with which the course of the Rhine is liberally studded, and hurled abuse at the Romans and the Caesar in a chorus of wild and doleful yells. Enraged by this and hoping to catch some of them, Julian asked Barbito for 7 of the vessels which he had procured in order to span the river by a bridge of boats, but Barbito, determined that Julian should get nothing from him, burned them all. Finally, Julian, learning from some scouts who had just been captured that since it was now high summer, the river was fordable, encouraged a body of light-armed auxiliaries under Binobaldes, the tribune of the Cornuti, to attempt an exploit which would bring them renown, if luck was on their side. Wading through the shallows and at times supporting themselves on their shields and swimming, they reached a nearby island which they landed on and slaughtered everyone they found there like sheep, without distinction of age or sex. Then, finding some empty boats, they went on them, rickety though they were, and forced their way through a number of similar places. Finally, when they were sick of slaughter, they all returned safe with a rich haul of loot, though some was carried away by the force of the stream. On hearing of this, the rest of the Germans, realizing that islands offered inadequate protection, conveyed their families and stores and primitive treasures to the further banks of the Rhine. Julian next turned to the task of repairing the fortifications of the strong point known as Severn, which the enemy had recently destroyed by a determined attack. Its rebuilding guaranteed that the Germans could no longer penetrate, as they had been used to do, into the heart of Gaul. He finished this work sooner than expected, and stockaded it with a whole year's provisions for the garrison which was to be stationed there. This was collected not without some risk from the enemy's crops, and not content with this, he gathered food for 20 days for himself as well. The troops felt particular satisfaction in using what their own hands had won. They were deeply incensed because they had received nothing from a convoy recently sent to them. Barbetio had arrogantly appropriated part of this as it passed near him, and then heaped up and burned what he did not want. Whether this was the effect of his own pride and folly, or whether it was the emperor's orders which led him to commit so many monstrous acts, it is even now an unresolved question. A rumour, however, was generally current that Julian had been appointed not to relieve the distresses of Gaul, but to ensure his own destruction in a fierce war, which he was still supposed to be a novice in, unlikely to be able to stand even the noises of alarm, let alone battle. While the fortifications of the camp were rapidly rising, and the troops were engaged partly in occupying advanced posts in the country about, partly in collecting corn with due precautions against an ambush, a host of barbarians, moving with such speed as to outstrip any news of their approach, made a sudden assault upon Barbetio and his army, which, as I have said, lay at a distance from the Gallic camp. They routed him and pursued him to August, and as far beyond as they could, and then returned home after capturing the greater part of his baggage train together with its drivers, Barbetio, behaving as if his campaign had ended in success, distributed his troops in winter quarters, and, true to form, returned to the court to frame some charges against the Caesar. Julian attacks and routs the barbarians at Strasbourg. When the news of this shameful stampede got abroad, Cnodemor and Vestralp, kings of the Alemanni, as well as Urius and Uricinus, together with Serapio and Salmar and Hortar, collected their whole strength together and advanced towards the city of Strasbourg, believing that the Caesar had retreated for fear of the worst, when in fact he was engaged at that moment in perfecting his defences. These chiefs held their heads high and acted with increased confidence because a deserter from the Scutari, who had come over to them after the departure of his defeated general to avoid punishment for an offence, informed them that Julian was left with only 13,000 men, the number, in fact, of the troops that were with him. Their natural ferocity roused in them generally a mad lust for battle, and the repeated assertions of the deserter raised their confidence still higher. So they sent envoys to the Caesar to bid him in an impious tone to excavate the territory and evacuate it, which they had won by their own valour at the point of the sword. But Julian, who did not know the meaning of fear, showed neither anger nor distress. He laughed at the insolence of the barbarians, who had detained their envoys till his fortifications were completed, adhering unflatteringly to the resolute stand which he had taken. Comrades, I will explain as briefly as possible that it is regard for our common safety and not any loss of heart which prompts me, your Caesar, to beg you, confident though you are in our stout and tired valour, to choose the path of caution rather than of haste and risk in meeting or repelling what we have to expect. It is right that warriors should be active and bold in situations of danger, but they should also, when occasion requires, be obedient and deliberate. I tell you briefly my opinion, and I hope that you will go along with it in spite of your justifiable impatience. It is already nearly midday, we are tired by our march, and the paths which we have to take will be rough and dark. The moon is waning, and there will be no stars to lighten up the night. The country before us is burnt up by the heat and entirely devoid of water. Even if these difficulties could be easily surmounted, what are we to do when we meet the attacks of the enemy's hordes, who will be rested and refreshed by food and drink? What strength shall we have to encounter them when we are worn out by hunger, thirst, and toil? But even the most difficult problems have often been solved by the exercise of foresight, and more than once sound advice taken in good part has miraculously rectified a dangerous position. I propose, therefore, that we set a watch and rest here, where we are protected by a rampart and a ditch. Then, at first light, after an adequate allowance of sleep and food, let us, God willing, advance our eagles to triumph and our standards to victory." The troops did not allow him to finish what he was saying, grinding their teeth and clashing their spears against their shields to show their eagerness for battle. They begged him to lead them against the enemy who was already in sight. They relied on the help of heaven, on their own morale, and on the tried abilities of a general who was the favourite of fortune. As the event showed, some guardian angel must have inspired them to fight while he was still there to assist them. Their enthusiasm was supported by the full approval of the higher command, and especially of Florientus, the Praetorian prefect. He urged that although there was a risk in joining battle, that risk must be accepted while conditions were favourable and the barbarians were in one mass. If they dispersed, it would be impossible to control the anger of the troops, whose native impetuosity made them apt to mutiny, and who would not, in his opinion, endure to see victory snatched from their grasp without resorting to desperate measures. A twofold consideration which added to the confidence of our men was this. In the year just past, when the Romans were ranging a large distance in the lands beyond the Rhine, no one appeared to defend his home or to offer resistance, the barbarians having blocked all the paths with a dense barrier of felled trees, kept at a distance through all the miseries of a freezing winter, and when the emperor himself entered their territory, they obtained items of peace by humble entreaties without daring to resist or show themselves. But no one noticed that the situation had now changed. Previously, they had had to face destruction from three sides. The emperor was pressing them on the Rhaetian front. The Caesar, who was nearest them, prevented them from slipping away in any direction, and their neighbours, with whom they had quarrelled, almost had their necks behind their heel, so that they were being beset on all hands. Now, however, the emperor had made peace with them and departed. They were on good terms with their neighbouring tribes, with whom they had composed their quarrel, and the disgraceful withdrawal of a Roman general had further whetted their natural ferocity. In addition, the difficulties of the Romans were compounded by the following circumstance. The two royal brothers, who were bound by the terms of the peace obtained from Constantius in a previous year, had not ventured to create a disturbance or make any move, but shortly afterwards one of them, Guandamad, the stronger and more trustworthy of the two, was treacherously murdered. all his people threw in their lot with our enemies, and the subjects of Weidamar, against his will, by his own account, at once joined forces with the barbarians who were clamouring for war. So, when all ranks from the highest to the lowest showed, without any weakening whatsoever of their resolve, their feeling that this was the right moment to fight, a standard-bearer suddenly shouted, "Follow Caesar, the guidance of your lucky star. You are fortune's darling, and in you we see that valour and judgment are at last combined. Give us a lead, like the lucky and brave warrior that you are. With heaven's blessing you shall see what your men can do under the eye of a warlike general who is inseparable from them when their blood is up." These words put an end to all delay. The army moved forward and reached a gently sloping hill covered with crops already ripe, a short distance only from the banks of the Rhine. On its top the enemy had stationed 3 mounted scouts, who went off at a gallop to announce the sudden approach of the Roman army, but one man on foot, who could not keep up with them, was captured through the nimbleness of our men, and revealed that the Germans had been crossing the river for 3 days and nights. When our commanders saw them a short way off forming themselves into dense wedges, they halted. The vanguard with their standard-bearers and junior officers made as it were an impregnable wall, and the enemy showed like caution and stood still in their formations. The vanguard with their standard-bearers and junior officers made as it were an impregnable wall, and the enemy showed like caution and stood still in their formations. When, as they had already been told by the deserter that I have mentioned, they saw all our cavalry drawn up on our right flank, they massed all their stronger mounted men on their own left flank, interspersed with light-armed men on foot, whose use was dictated by considerations of safety. They knew that for all his skill a mounted warrior meeting one of our cuirassiers, and using one hand to hold his reins and shield, and the other to brandish his spear, could inflict no harm on an opponent dressed in mail, whereas in the heat of the fight, when a man is occupied solely with the danger that stares him in the face, someone on foot, creeping along unnoticed close to the ground, can stab a horse in the flank, bring his rider headlong to the ground, and finish him off without difficulty. Having made these dispositions, they also stationed troops in ambush on the right wing, flanking to effect a surprise. All those warlike and savage tribes were led by Conodemar and Serapio, whose power exceeded that of the other kings. Conodemar, whose pernicious influence was responsible for the whole war, rode with a flame-coloured plume on his head before the left wing, where he thought the battle would be hottest. He was a bold fighter, confident in the strength of his own right arm, and his huge bulk towered aloft on his foaming steed, ready to hurl a javelin of appalling size. His gleaming armour marked him out from the rest, and his energy as a soldier was equalled by his preeminence as a commander. The right wing was led by Serapio, a young man whose cheeks still carried a growth of down, but who was capable beyond his years. He was the son of Mederic, Conodemar's brother, a man who had been utterly faithless all his life. He owed his name to the fact that his father, who was initiated into certain Greek mysteries during a long period as a hostage in Gaul, changed his son's name to Serapio from that of Agneric, which he had been given at birth. These two were followed by the next most powerful kings, 5 in number, by 10 princes and a long train of nobles, and by an army of 35,000 men drawn from various peoples, some of whom served as mercenaries and the rest in accordance with pacts of mutual assistance. Now, while the trumpets were sounding their fearful note, Severus, who commanded the Roman left wing, came in his advance near trenches packed with troops. They had been hidden there with the idea of throwing everything into disarray by a sudden sally. Severus halted without any sign of fear, and suspecting an ambush neither withdrew nor attempted to advance further. The Caesar, whose spirit was equal to the greatest dangers, grasped the situation. He had with him an escort of 200 cavalry, as the importance of the occasion required, and he urged on the column of infantry with words and gestures to lose no time in launching an attack at several points. He could not address them in a body because of the wide extent of the front and the large numbers involved. Another reason for not doing so was the fear of the odium which he would incur by adopting a course which the Augustus regarded as his own prerogative. So without thought for his own safety, he flew along the lines within range of the enemy and encouraged his men, known and unknown alike, to deeds of valour, with words like these: "Now, comrades, the moment to fight has come, the moment which you and I have longed for, the moment to which you clamoured to be brought just now, when you impatiently called for battle." Similarly, when he came to those who were posted behind the standards in the extreme rear, he shouted, "Companions in arms, the long-hoped-for day is here, when we must all wipe out previous stains and restore the proper glory to the majesty of Rome. These are the barbarians whose rage and unbridled folly have led them to meet our forces in an encounter which must end in their destruction." Again, when he was making some adjustments in the battle order of other troops, whose fighting skill was based on long experience, he encouraged them by saying, "Up, my heroes! Our courage shall dispel the disgrace inflicted on our cause. It was the thought of this which led me, after much hesitation, to accept the title of Caesar." But to those who were clamouring for battle thoughtlessly, and who he saw might frustrate his plan by their impatience, he said, "Do not, I beg you, impair the victory that awaits us by being too eager in pursuit of the enemy we have to rout, and do not give ground except in the last extremity. Be in no doubt that I shall leave all who flee to their fate, whereas nothing shall divide me from those who smite the enemy in the back, provided they show proper judgment and caution." With frequent repetition of words of this kind, he deployed the greater part of his army opposite the front rank of the barbarians. Suddenly an indignant shout was heard among the infantry of the Alemanni. They demanded with one voice that the princes should abandon their horses and take their stand with them. They were afraid that in the event of defeat the leaders would have an easy means of escape and leave their wretched followers in the lurch. When he learned of this, Conodomar at once jumped down from his mount, and the rest followed his example without hesitation. None of them doubted that victory would be theirs. When the traditional signal to engage was sounded on both sides, a violent battle ensued. After a short exchange of missiles, the Germans rushed forward with more haste than caution, brandishing their weapons and throwing themselves upon our squadrons of horse, with horrible grinding of their teeth, and more than the usual fury. Their hair streamed behind them, and a kind of madness flashed from their eyes. Our men faced them stubbornly, protecting their heads with their shields, and trying to strike fear into the foe, with drawn swords, or the deadly javelins that they brandished. At the very crisis of the battle, when our cavalry was bravely regrouping, and the infantry were stoutly protecting their flanks with a wall of seared shields, thick clouds of dust arose, and the fight swayed this way and that. At one moment our men stood firm, at the next they gave way, and some of the most experienced fighters among the barbarians tried to force their foes backwards by the pressure of their knees. Obstinately, They struggled hand to hand and shield to shield. The welkin rang with the shouts of the victors and the screams of the wounded. But while our left wing, moving in close order, had thrown back by main force the columns of Germans which assailed it, and was advancing in fury upon the barbarians, our cavalry on the right unexpectedly gave way in disorder. They then began to shift each for himself, and would have created total confusion by trampling on the infantry had not the latter, who were drawn up in very close order, held their ground. The Caesar, seeing from a distance his cavalry turning to flight, put spurs to his horse and threw himself in their path. He was recognised by the purple dragon attached to the tip of a long lance, and streaming on the wind like the cast skin of a snake, and the tribune of the squadron stopped and turned back pale and trembling to renew the fight. The Caesar took the course usual in moments of crisis, and addressed the men in terms of mild reproach. "Where are we off to, my brave fellows? Don't you know that flight never saved anyone? It is simply a proof of the folly of a vain enterprise. Let us return to our comrades, and at least have a share in their glory, even though we have thoughtlessly abandoned them in their fight for our country." This tactful speech brought them all back to their duty. Allowing for some differences, it followed the example set by Sulla in times past. In a pitched battle against Archelaus, the general of Mithridates, Sulla was becoming exhausted by the violence of the struggle and found himself deserted by his troops. He rushed to the front rank, seized a standard, and hurled it towards the enemy. "Be off," he shouted, "you whom I picked to share my danger, and when you are asked where you left your general, answer truthfully, fighting alone in Boeotia, and shedding his blood for all of us." Then the Alemanni, having defeated and scattered our cavalry, attacked the front line of our infantry, intending to break their will to resist and to put them to flight. But when they came to close quarters, the issue remained long in doubt. The Cornuti and Bracciati, veterans long experienced in war, intimidated the enemy by their bearing and put all their strength into their famous war cry. This is a shout which they raise when a fight is actually at boiling point. It begins with a low murmur and gradually increases in volume until it resounds like the sea dashing against a cliff. Volleys of javelins flew hissing through the air from both sides. A uniform cloud of dust arose and obscured the field, in which arms were hurtling against arms and bodies against bodies. The barbarians lost all order. Their rage and fury blazed like a fire. As they set themselves to cleave asunder with repeated sword strokes, the shields, closely interlaced in tortoise formation, which protected our men. Seeing what was happening, the Batavians, a redoubtable body, came at the double, together with the regiment called Kings, to help their comrades, and to extricate them, if luck was on their side, from the desperate situation in which they were entrapped. The trumpets sounded a harsh note as they fought with redoubled energy. But the Alemanni, hurling themselves into the fight, strove like inspired madmen to destroy everything before them. Yet the hail of darts and javelins and the volleys of iron-tipped arrows did not slacken, although blade was clashing on blade in hand-to-hand conflict. Breastplates were split asunder by sword blows, and wounded men, who still had some blood left, rose from the ground to attempt some further exploit. In a sense, it was a battle of equals. The Alemanni had the advantage of strength and height, the Romans of training and discipline. One side was wild and turbulent, the other deliberate and cautious. Our men relied on their courage, the enemy on their prodigious physique. Often, however, a Roman who had been overwhelmed by the weight of the enemy's arms would rise up again, when a barbarian whose legs had given way from fatigue would bend his left knee as he sank into the ground and continue to attack his foe, a proof of supreme resolution. Suddenly there leapt forward, burning for the fight, a troop of notables which included even the king. With their men behind them, they burst upon our line and forced their way as far as the legion of Primani, which was stationed at the centre of our position in the formation which is known as Praetorian Camp. Here our troops were drawn up in close formation and in several ranks. They stood as firm as towers and renewed the battle with increased spirit. Taking care to avoid being wounded and covering themselves like gladiators, they plunged their swords into the barbarians' sides, which their wild rage left exposed. The enemy, who were ready to squander their lives for victory, tried repeatedly to find weak spots in the fabric of our line. As they perished one after another, and the confidence of the Romans who were striking them down increased, fresh hosts took the place of the slain, till the incessant cries of the dying stupefied them with fear. Then, at last, they gave way under the stress of disaster and put all their energy into attempts at flight. In their haste to get away, they took various paths, like the crew and passengers of a wreck in a storm at sea, who are eager to get to land wherever the wind carries them. Anyone who was present will vouch that they had more reason to pray than to hope for escape. The favour of a beneficent providence was on our side. Our men hacked at the backs of the retreating foe, and when, as sometimes happened, the swords bent and they had nothing to strike with, they seized the weapons of the barbarians and thrust them into their vitals. None could be found whose rage was glutted with blood, none whose right hand grew weary with repeated slaughter, none who had pity on a man who begged for mercy. So a great number lay mortally wounded, praying for the relief of a speedy death. Others, half dead and hardly able to breathe, sought to catch a last glimpse of the light with their dying eyes. Some had their heads severed by pikes as massive as beams, so that they hung merely by the throat. Others, who had slipped in the blood of their comrades on the muddy and treacherous ground, were suffocated under the heaps of the bodies which tumbled on top of them, and died without receiving any wounds. At this highly successful outcome, our victorious troops pressed on still more strongly. Their weapons were blunted by incessant use, and gleaming helmets and shields rolled underfoot. At last, the barbarians, driven to extremity and finding their escape blocked by high heaps of corpses, resorted to the only expedient left, the river, which was almost touching their backs. Under the pressure tirelessly maintained by our troops in spite of the weight of their arms, some of the fugitives, believing that they could escape because they could swim, entrusted their lives to the water. This caused the Caesar, who saw in a flash what was likely to ensue, to give peremptory orders, which were repeated by the tribunes and superior officers, forbidding any of our men to plunge into the eddying stream in overeager pursuit of the foe. The order was obeyed, and our men stood on the bank, transfixing the Germans with missiles of various kinds. Any of the latter who were quick enough to escape death in this form were carried to the bottom by the weight of their own bodies. The scene now resembled a stage show, when the curtain reveals some wonderful spectacle. Henceforth one could watch in perfect security some who could not swim clinging to strong swimmers, others floating like logs when they were left behind by their faster companions, others again being swept away and swallowed by the raging stream as if it had a personal spite against them. Some, supported on their shields, avoided the steep walls of water which met them by taking an oblique course, and after many a narrow escape succeeded in reaching the opposite bank. The discoloured river, foaming with barbarian blood, was lost in wonder at this strange addition to its waters. Meanwhile, King Ketone-Kun, finding a chance to escape by slipping through the heaps of slain with a few attendants, made his way in great haste to the camp which he had been bold enough to establish near the Roman fortification of Concordia. His plan was to embark on some boats which he had long kept in readiness for an emergency and hide himself in a secret refuge. Since he could reach his own territory only by crossing the Rhine, he hid his face for fear of recognition and retreated gradually. He was already near the bank and making a detour round an inlet flooded with marsh water with the idea of crossing the river, when his horse slipped on the soft and sticky ground and threw him. There he was recognised. The high station which he had occupied made it impossible for him to conceal his identity, and a cohort with its tribunes came after him in breathless haste and surrounded his position in the wooded heights. They acted with caution and did not attempt to break through, for fear of being caught in an ambush in the gloom of the thicket. At the sight of them, Ketone-Kun was reduced to utter panic, and came out of the wood alone, and gave himself up. His attendants, to the number of 200, together with 3 very close friends, also surrendered, considering it a disgrace to survive their king, or not to die for him if the occasion required it. Ketone-Kun, like all barbarians, was as submissive in disaster as he was the opposite in success. Finding himself in another's power, he was dragged along pale and dismayed, speechless from consciousness of his crimes, a different being from the man who, after a course of wild and deplorable outrages, trampled upon the ashes of Gaul, and uttered a string of savage threats. At the close of day, when the favour of heaven had brought the battle to this successful end, the troops reluctantly obeyed the signal to return and pitched their camp near the bank of the Rhine, where they were protected by several rows of pickets and able to enjoy food and sleep. The Romans had lost 243 men and 4 officers. Baenobaudes, tribune of the Cornuti, together with Lipso Innocentius, who commanded the cuirassiers, and an unattached tribune whose name I do not know. Of the Alemanni, however, 6,000 bodies were counted lying on the field, not to mention the masses of dead carried off by the river, whose number cannot be reckoned. Julian, who had shown himself a man whose merits were above his position, and whose authority was based more on his deserts than on his rank, was now hailed as Augustus by the unanimous voice of the whole army. But he rebuked the troops for this thoughtless behaviour, and solemnly affirmed with an oath that this was an elevation which he neither expected nor desired. To add to the general's joy at this happy outcome, he ordered Ketone-Kun to be brought before him in the presence of the assembled troops. Ketone-Kun first bowed low, and then prostrated himself on the ground in an attitude of supplication. Julian told him to take heart. A few days later he was taken to the emperor's court, and from there sent to Rome, where he fell into a lethargy and died in the barracks assigned to foreign troops on the Caelian Hill. When all these efforts had been crowned by success, some of Constantius' courtiers sought to please the emperor either by finding fault with Julian, or by referring to him ironically as Victorinus, because in his modest reports of his conduct of his command he often mentioned that the Germans had been defeated. By frequent repetition of empty praises, and a vain parade of facts which were obvious, they inflated Constantius' natural self-conceit after their usual manner, ascribing to his lucky star any success in any corner of the world. The big talk by his toadies encouraged him to set forth in the edicts which he published then and later a number of arrogant lies. Though he had not been present himself at an action, he often declared that he alone had fought and conquered, and inclined a merciful ear to the entreaties of native kings. If, for example, while he was in Italy, one of his generals distinguished himself against the Persians, no mention would be made of him in a very long bulletin, but letters wreathed in laurel would be sent to extract money from the provinces, in which Constantius informed them, with odious self-praise, that he had fought in the front ranks. Statements by him are still extant in the imperial records, which show his vainglorious habit of praising himself to the sky. When this battle was fought near Strasbourg, from which he was 40 days' march away, his account of the action stated that he had drawn up the order of battle, taken his place by the standards, put the barbarians to flight, and had Ketone-Kun brought before him. Disgraceful to relate, he said nothing of the glorious exploits of Julian, which he would have buried in utter oblivion, but common report forbids the suppression of great achievements, however many people try to keep them in the shade.